You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fandom culture as a whole. For more information about the show and the other show that I do, 17 Karat K-Pop, visit 17karatkpop.weebly.com. You can also go to 17karatkpop.weebly.com/howtostan for more specific information about this podcast. Enjoy the show. You're listening to How to Stan. This is episode 6, Boy Bands versus Sports Teams. I know on the surface it seems odd why I would group sports fans and Beatlemania into the same episode, but trust me, there are a lot of parallels, and it's worth looking at these fandoms side by side. So in general, studies of pop culture fandom specifically took off in the 1980s, and this was also a time when young females, young teenage girls, were targeted more and more by marketing campaigns. They were viewed as a key base to target teenage girl stereotypes about who is a fangirl. That really came about starting in the 80s. The word hysteria was long been associated with females. It's not just from past centuries, this is relatively recent. In a 2000 sociology paper, quote, a metaphor for anything considered unmanageable in the female sex. So the term hysteria really has, over time, by psychologists and sociologists alike, been seen as something females get up to. They get hysterical, they get thrown into hysterics with these bands and their presence. And this type of language that really pathologizes, really patronizes fangirls, for lack of a better phrase for the situation, that's been constant. It's been constant. If you think about phrases like Bieber fever or One Direction infection, and in general mania, the term mania applied to Beatles fans, these female fans of musicians and other sources of pop culture have routinely language has been applied to them that has such negative connotations, such scorn and disdain. There's this key description that pretty much sums up the mentality of the people writing about female fandoms of musicians from this Wall Street Journal piece about the Bieber fandom that was coined as Bieber fever. So the Wall Street Journal said, quote, the symptoms include uncontrollable screaming, swooning, and spending hours on Twitter and Facebook. It primarily affects preteen and teen girls, yet it is highly contagious and can infect mothers too. In severe cases, sufferers camp out on sidewalks for days. By disease standards, Bieber fever is approaching a global pandemic. Terrible choice of words that did not age well. And the Wall Street Journal was not unique in this description that did not age well at all. So the phrase teeny bopper was constantly applied to female fans of pop stars in the mid-1960s and going forward. So in the American Heritage Dictionary, they define teeny bopper as young adolescent girls, really, that are, quote, held to be devoted to perpetual stylistic novelty, as in fashion or social behavior. It's really been defined over time as teenage girls specifically being obsessed with certain types of pop music that was deemed superficial, and a teeny bopper was viewed as a fan that was very fickle, just really in the fandom for superficial reasons, and was going to move on quickly, viewed as easily manipulated consumers. I mean, teenage girls were targeted in part due to those sexist assumptions about how fickle they would be and how much money they would be willing to spend on things that didn't mean anything, and they were very much belittled in that sense. So there is a key New York Times piece about this term, really, by John Perelson, called When Pop Becomes the Toy of Teeny Boppers. And basically this piece describes teeny bopper interests in a very threatening way, as a threat to real music, to authentic music, viewing it as this permanent erosion of deep meaning music, viewing this pop music as all bubblegum, and therefore it's threatening the presence of what is considered real, meaningful, deep, layered music with just bubblegum stuff. And he used the term kiddie pop as well in this piece, and viewed kiddie pop as, quote, an intermission between crises. And again, he was not alone in this description. A key one that really sums up the whole piece is this quote. This season belongs to the kiddie pop brigades. Applause is passé. The reaction most eagerly sought by pop culture right now is a high-pitched squeal from a mob of young girls. When it's directed at males, that squeal signifies romantic fantasy while it tests out some newly active hormonal responses. Directed at females, it's a squeal of sisterly solidarity and fashion approval, and for the last few years its volume has been steadily rising until it threatens to drown out anything with more mature audiences in mind. So there is a lot to unpack there. One of the key reasons why this conceptualization of a female fan has persisted and been viewed as the normal way fangirls act is because of media pieces like this, which were often written by males who didn't get the appeal and had a lot of internalized assumptions about the interests of young girls and what interests were unacceptable to people who were not young girls. And so if we really break down this quote, first of all, starting with the applause is passé line, he's basically saying that if the girls are going to scream in a concert for anything, that means that kind of the screams lose their impact and lose their meaning. And that kind of makes sense, but also I would argue that that is not something that just happens for this instance. He's viewing it as, well, they only... If you applaud everything, you're applauding nothing, really. Applause have no meaning. If everything gets a standing ovation, for example, then nothing is viewed as exceptional, and you're not giving a great review. You just view everything your favorite does as amazing. But I would argue that's an issue in sports as well. If we think about, like, do you suddenly just cheer when your team... Like, should there be metrics? Like, you can only cheer for your favorite team that you're supporting when they reach a certain score level or something. The applause doesn't work like that for them, and it's just, there's a constant scream. The crowd doesn't suddenly go silent at football games, for example, so it's weird to assume that it should for concerts that girls are attending. Also, there's the term mob that is used a lot, and that's very problematic for a lot of reasons. Also, there are all these heteronormative assumptions that have really been part of the marketing campaigns over the years, too, that you need to target females. Females love male groups because they love to fantasize about being in relationships with them. And males might enjoy female groups because they want to fantasize about having relationships with them. Any thought of, non-heteronormative assumptions about who's into who and who's in this for more than just looks and not even crushes in general seem to not be something that even crossed their minds. Also, he basically talks about drowning out other noise. Again, viewing it as kiddie pop, as he calls it, threatens real music. So the long history here, I think, is better understood when we look at a different piece. This is from a sociologist, Gail Wald, from the University of Colorado Boulder. It was called I Want It That Way, Teeny Bopper Music and the Girling of Boy Bands. And this piece points out that spaces often have gendered assumptions and characteristics with them. So if you think about music genres, you probably envision a certain location. So if you just hear the phrase rock music video or performing rock music, you may view that as associated with, in your mind, the image of a garage setting, like a literal garage band or some other basement setting, something that's just kind of rough, for lack of a better term, not really heavily decorated. It's just one of those kind of places. And then if you're thinking about like country music, maybe your stereotypical assumption is like you're in a barn or something, I don't know, or just in a field, something in a rural area. It has a place associated with it, though, whatever that is. Whereas pop music, the first place you think of is, it's hard to tell. I mean, maybe a concert, maybe a recording studio, but not like what's viewed as an authentic environment. Just a room full of technology, or no room at all comes to mind. Over time, this goes to show that the lack of a setting that pop music has been assigned to is part of its appeal, because then it can be relevant no matter where you are in life. But at the same time, it's a drawback in the public consciousness because it makes them view it as having no real place. And so this language has been used over time because not just have females over time been belittled or dismissed as crazy or way too obsessed, but they have alongside this belittling of the music that they like and that anyone could like, but over time it just became more and more associated with these fangirls. So rock music is a great counter to this point. Rock music has always been viewed as real music. That's just a term always used with authentic or rugged, those terms. Whereas pop music has always been associated with terms like bubblegum or, super light and fun. Terms that refer to it as kind of ditzy and just not all that deep, and that has fed into those stereotypes as well. Broke down really why the impact of the Backstreet Boys' I Want It That Way music video was so big, and really referred to the ways that the video perpetuated what people expected. And so that familiarity, that typical stereotypes bring a sense of familiarity, which leads people to continue to watch them. There's just something subconsciously comforting about seeing the familiar, and seeing something that's not familiar is a little jarring to people. And so it was viewed as just a super normal video, in the sense that this boy band makes a lot of eye contact with the camera in the video, and they're in this airport setting, and you see the fans at the airport to greet them holding up signs and stuff. Of course, it's a primarily female, if not all female crowd there for them. It's really just feeds into all the boy band stereotypes, this video, which was really part of its appeal. It was what people expected. Whereas if it was a bunch of guys screaming and cheering, people would view that as maybe a parody, or just something that made them do a double take. It's not normalized for male fans to just enjoy the Backstreet Boys without any romantic connotations assumed of it. TRL really did contribute to certain views of fans on the national stage, with how the cameras would show different female fans that had shown up holding their big signs for the Backstreet Boys and all of that. And fans would constantly physically show up at Times Square to campaign in support of I Want It That Way, getting higher on the ranking of the day. And actually, I Want It That Way broke such records, and it was on the TRL voting chart for so long that the producers were eventually forced to take it out of. They didn't naturally just leave the charts. It had to be manually removed from consideration to make room for newer music. Blink-182 made this video in 1999 called, well, it was an I Want It That Way parody, but they called it All the Small Things. They've also parodied other music videos, but this one really, really epitomizes what I'm trying to say. So in their All the Small Things video, Blink-182 mocks the Backstreet Boys video, and mocks boy band videos in general. They have like sexy poses and just playful, flirty poses, but clearly in a mocking way they're doing them, and it's all making fun of those types of videos and the people who like them. It led to a lot of conversation, though, for the Backstreet Boys video too. So not only did it revive a conversation about I Want It That Way, but it also helped take Blink-182's popularity to new heights. What the main takeaway from what they did is that even if you're trying to make fun of and mock the Backstreet Boys appeal and the appeal of other boy bands, you actually may end up being a boy band yourself. Even if it's in a parody form, the boy band format works and it appeals to people. And so again, that familiarity of a concept is very appealing to people, and just that's why people perpetuate a lot of stereotypes, because the familiar is something that they have grown to really appreciate, or at least prefer. Another sociology study that is worth pointing out here is one about Duran Duran fandoms. It was called Still Kissing Their Posters Goodnight. It was a fan study that compiled interviews with survey info, ethnographic info of other forms. This sociology research was conducted by T. Anderson from the University of North Texas, and basically what she was looking at is reasons why these women had this lifelong Duran Duran fandom affiliation. They never really grew out of what would be stereotyped as their teeny bopper phase. Into adulthood, they remained Duran Duran fans, and she wanted to really dig into why from a sociological perspective. She looked at and realized is that there was this whole thing with bedroom culture. Bedroom culture basically referring to how teenage girls decorate their bedrooms as kind of a safe space where they avoid judgment, and it's kind of their sanctuary where they can put posters on their walls and otherwise just fangirl watch videos with their favorite boy band and show off their merch and all of that. She tapped into a lot of previous scholarship on the divisions that we form as humans between our public and private lives, and that was very much solidified, those lines, through bedroom culture, meaning once you put up Duran Duran posters on your wall, for example, your room becomes something much more than just your room. It is a sanctuary. It is a clear dividing line between the outside world that judges you for that obsession, as they call it, and you just enjoying judgment-free in your room. And so she really talks about that a lot. There's a classic sociology study she looks at from McGroby and Garber from 1976 that was added onto over time, and she added to it more, basically pointing out, and other scholars have too, how this has changed over time, especially with social media and the internet, that those public and private spheres of our lives are not just clear-cut anymore, and there's a lot of overlap, and that's referred to as zoning, and we won't get into all the sociology terms of it all, but basically, bedroom culture still exists, but in different forms these days, and it's still so important to people to feel like they have a place to truly fully be themselves and take any masks off and just be themselves without being judged. And bedroom culture is this kind of way also of, she describes it as a way of flipping this traditional narrative on its head, because music videos have over time constantly been directed, produced, filmed, and created with the male gaze in mind. By men for men, essentially. Music videos are for, male eyes, male consumption, and women dress sexy for them, and that has just been such a dominant narrative over time. So this author views bedroom culture as helping flip that in reverse and allowing females to be the ones that get their gaze appealed to, the female gaze, where they get a place to just feel free to stare at the guys as opposed to vice versa. She really didn't necessarily intend for this to be a feminist stance of any kind. Really, she viewed it as more of for females to just feel more validated in terms of avoiding the personal heartbreak that would come with real relationships. So imagining relationships with your favorite boy band member was just a lot easier emotionally, and it was a protective thing subconsciously. That's what she referred to more, but some scholars over time have incorporated this into their feminist arguments as well for doing this and flipping the male gaze on its head. She also, from this Duran Duran study, there are a couple other conclusions I want to highlight. First of all, she pointed out that bedroom culture can continue into adulthood, and that can continue more easily now thanks to, again, the internet and being able to still keep your favorite band at the front of your mind because you're talking to other fans all the time about that band, so they stay in your mind more often because you're talking about them more often. They're a part of your daily conversations. Also, the stats from the study showed that 97% of these fans reported having a poster on their wall of Duran Duran at some point. 83% said they had been screaming while at a Duran concert. I'm not sure where the other percent was, because I would assume 100% screamed at a concert, but whatever. And a significant number of the respondents did say that they became a fan after they had initially formed a crush on a band member. So, not to say that certain characterizations of fans are just flat out false, but the problem comes when it's the only narrative, and that leads to stereotyping. If there were a variety of perspectives incorporated into talking about fangirls, then it would be a different story. There's a book by Camille Bacon-Smith called Enterprising Women, Television Fandom and the Creation of Popular Myth, which basically contributes to this pathologizing of the female fan. It portrays a lot of fans in just this neurotic and demeaning way and views them as these subjects that are worthy of scrutiny. And counter to that was this study in the British Journal of Clinical Psychology in 1966. And this clinical psychology study actually counteracted a piece that we're going to talk about later. When we talk more about Beatlemania specifically, this author wrote the most complained about piece in a magazine's history, criticizing Beatles fans. And he dismissed them and called them hysterical. And so this British Journal of Clinical Psychology basically issued a rebuttal to him by actually conducting a study. They looked at their hysteria scale, where they have like all this criteria, and if you meet a certain numerical amount, that you are considered hysterical clinically. And so they actually applied that to Beatles fans and non-Beatles fans. And they found, so it's scientifically proven, they found that people who were under the spell of Beatlemania, as they viewed it, were no more likely to be considered clinically hysterical than non-Beatles fans. And a key quote from the study is, quote, "The passing reaction of predominantly young adolescent females to group pressures of such a kind just meets their special emotional needs." So really, they viewed it as, again, it's a way for females to feel like they can just unashamedly enjoy content. It's a way to emphasize personalization of their bedroom and their life at home, away from others, and it's viewed as just an outlet for them to avoid the real heartbreak that comes with true relationships if they can just fantasize about a relationship. So it's just meeting these emotional needs of teenage girls and other teenagers too, but of course the stereotype claims otherwise. There were a lot of people that did critique Camille Bacon-Smith's book that really dismissed all females as neurotic. Cornel Sandvoss we're going to talk about a lot in future episodes, but I'll just say for now he has this book called Fans the Mirror of Consumption, and he argues totally against Bacon-Smith's generalizations, calls them overgeneralizations, and he also points out that any fan that you would call neurotic is not even the majority of fans. The majority of fans are not, the extremes who might be labeled as stalkers or, clinically obsessed or anything like that. He argues in defense of fans. He talks about how fandom studies need to stop limiting their focus and analysis on fandom in the context of relationships and view it more as having to do with the psychology of the self and how people come into their own. So he pointed out that the problem with this, the way of that sociologists have tried to study and observe and interview and collect all this qualitative data about fandom culture, is that it's been all about the relationship. The one that he labels as, they've described it as, quote, possessive, and really it's focused on why do you like them, and especially why do you crush on them, whereas he wanted to view it as totally less about the relationships and more about just psychologically what it does individually. So not about your connection to them, but just within yourself, what does this band fulfill for you psychologically? Thought it should be a more internal reflection with less external judgment. He also said that physical symbols of your fandom status, like posters on your walls, should be viewed as, quote, narrative focal points and view them as mirrors. That's why this book is called Fans the Mirror of Consumption, because those are viewed as like external manifestations that allow fans to show and symbolize a part of their identity that they've formed over time, and especially during an impressionable phase in life when you're a teenager. It can have a lifelong impact when you are able to find these tools to outwardly show people who you are. It can be very empowering in that sense. He really credited fans with a lot more agency than anyone who is reporting about them as delusional or obsessed, and he just viewed fans as intentionally being fans, not swept up in a love spell or anything, but just finding a way to express themselves, feel like they're a part of something, and better get to know what they are and what they appreciate in others, because that's what the celebrities they love can come to represent, what they appreciate or what they hope to emulate in their own lives. These celebrities can be truly their role models and idols for that reason, and that does not need to be viewed as harmful necessarily. What does all of this have to do with sports fans? Well, it has to do with the fact that pop culture studies and sports fan studies didn't have to be so different. They took on very divergent paths over time, but to study those fandoms never needed to be divergent. The fandoms at their core, there's not much different between them. But now, sports fans are viewed as so mainstream and normalized, and any emotional outbursts they have are just par for the course, and that's just the normal reaction. Whereas for fans of pop stars and boy bands, their screaming is viewed as irrational, and the pop culture fans overall are viewed as more fickle. Those fandoms are viewed as less mainstream and more of a counterculture in some senses. So the characterizations of sports fans versus pop culture fans, those differences that have been identified really don't carry weight. Those things have just been perpetuated and assumed, but that's not really the case. And so these characterizations have lasted in our minds for so long that they're viewed as just the natural differences between these fandoms, when that's not true. And there are studies to back that up. For example, There was a study released in the International Journal of Sport Studies that revealed that these sporting events predisposed these fans to these uncontrollable emotional outbursts that would be very comparable to pop culture outbursts. That connection was not directly drawn, but you see what I mean. In a Journal of Sport Studies about women's comments and reactions to sporting events, they proved through this study that women knew just as much knowledge as the men did about the sports they'd watched, and they could also express just as much enthusiasm and have the most heated discussions or feuds about what happened. In a study published in Sociology of Sport, some phone interviews revealed that men and women reacted in nearly identical ways to the exact same sports questions, so it wasn't like a difference in knowledge about the sports they were watching and their enthusiasm for it. In the Journal of Sport Behavior, these questionnaires revealed that males showed a stronger identification as being a fan of a certain team, but the men and women just showed a roughly equal amount of being a sports fan overall. So specific team identification, male fans, but overall male and female fans were equally likely to like watching those sports, which shows that if either males or females have to be characterized as the more obsessed ones, I would argue it is males there, but there's also a paper called Women Play Sport But Not on TV from the University of Southern California and Purdue University together, and these people found out that through an analysis of 6 weeks worth of TV sports viewing, both broadcast nationally and local sporting events, they found a very significantly lower amount of time spent talking about female athletes and female sporting events. Their key finding is, quote, "We argue that the amount of coverage of women's sports and the quality of that coverage illustrates the ways in which the news media builds audiences for men's sports while silencing and marginalizing women's sport. Moreover, the overall lack of coverage of women's sport, despite the tremendous increased participation of girls and women in sport at the high school, collegiate, and professional levels, conveys a message to audiences that sport continues to be by, for, and about men." So really what they were getting at is the fact that female fans are just as passionate about playing and watching sports as male fans, but over time, the amount of media coverage on male sports has contributed to this subconscious assumption that sports is a guy thing to enjoy, when that's never really been the case, but it just appears that way if you just turn on the TV or read the paper. On the flip side, there are also probably a lot of male fans of pop culture. And they just don't get the media attention because they're not considered normalized, and therefore the audience is not viewed as likely to react positively to that coverage, so the coverage is just avoided altogether, as opposed to expanding the horizons of viewers, unfortunately. So I do want to talk about Beatlemania and a timeline of it, how it did get quite out of hand, objectively out of hand at times, but I also want to counter that with examples of when sports fans took things too far to show you that this is not a feminine thing or a masculine thing. This is a fandom thing and just in general a cultural thing, and the only reason why the male reactions are more normalized is due to all this internalized misogyny that I've already cited. So after the break, we will get into those discussions. Here is a condensed timeline of Beatlemania, how the term got started and what it evolved into. So first of all, it routinely involved a lot of concert behavior that you probably expect, throwing things on stage, screaming really loudly, all of that. One of the wilder facts I learned when reading about Beatlemania is that it just took one comment for fans to end up throwing a bunch of jelly beans on stage routinely. Just one time in an interview, one of the members of the Beatles commented he liked jelly beans, and that's all it took for fans to throw jelly beans at the stage throughout a lot of tour dates. So that is just a fun side fact. But now let's get to the timeline. So October 13th of 1963, the Beatles performed on Sunday night at the London Palladium, which was at the time the UK's top variety show. 15 million people tuned in for that, and the next day, right away, the term Beatlemania was already being used after that one TV appearance. The name just stuck from there, and so Halloween of that year at the Heathrow Airport, thousands showed up. It was pouring rain, but that didn't stop. That actually required the British Prime Minister, Alec Douglas home, to be escorted out through a different vehicle. He couldn't get to his car because fans blocked it. There were so many fans, so he needed to find a new way to get out of there. Also, also at that same incident, Miss World was in the airport, but the paparazzi entirely ignored her. She could just walk through the airport unseen and unheard while everyone paid attention to the Beatles. So the Fandemonium, as it was called, continued in November of that year with the Autumn Tour. And through this Autumn Tour, it was the first tour that the Beatles were actually called headliners at. Police ended up using water hose against the rabid crowds, and that led to debates in Parliament about how to better protect the cops. The cops were a big concern at the time. So the 1964 World Tour in Australia led to huge crowds meeting them again despite heavy rain at the airport. There was one incident during that time in Australia where a woman ended up throwing her young son into this open top truck that the Beatles were riding in. She threw her son onto Paul McCartney and yelled, "Catch him, Paul," which luckily he did and no one was hurt. But of course he gave the son back right away, and she was so excited and thinking, he's cured. And from then on out, Paul McCartney was viewed as this miracle worker who cured people somehow, and so that was just one of many incidents where truly there was a view of the Beatles as not even human, but saviors of sorts. On June 12th of that year, 300,000 Australians turned out and broke a record in Australia for most people gathered in one place. It was twice the number of people compared to who turned out for Queen Elizabeth II's royal visit to Australia. That was again at an airport. June 14th, during their Melbourne stay, fans camped outside of the hotel, and they tried so hard to get a better view of the Beatles and their hotel room that they climbed up trees and other structures, and 50 people ended up getting injured and hospitalized due to those efforts. The tour then went on to New Zealand, where authorities protested their lack of support that they claimed they had for handling this mob that they described it as, that the Beatles actually were only provided in New Zealand with 3 police escorts. And so the roadies that were with them had their work cut out for them trying to assist with being security guards to get them through crowds. So it didn't really work, this police protest, because it didn't really change any fan behavior, and it just made the Beatles' lives harder that day. During that Vancouver stop of the tour, 160 fans got injured because they rushed a security barrier and toppled it, which fell on people. September 11th that year in Jacksonville, Florida, it was so difficult for the Beatles to get to the limo that it took them 15 minutes, and it was 25 feet away from them. June of 1966, in Germany, police ended up using tear gas and guard dogs against the crowds. Eventually, the Beatles couldn't take any of these incidents anymore, and they started pre-recording their performances, which would be shown during late-night talk shows and whatnot at a later date, but they just would never have those in-studio filming opportunities again, which actually ended up contributing to and being one of the many factors to add to fans' decreased mania over time. It really kind of fizzled out. This magazine that was prominent at the time called Melody Maker in May of '66 showed that 80% of respondents were disappointed in the recent lack of Beatles promo and appearances and shows, and thought that Beatlemania was in decline. Fans were further disillusioned with the Beatles when they released Strawberry Fields Forever and other releases that indicated they were growing up. They were showing a more mature image, and it was just so new to them, it was a bit of a shock to them. And so the author of this book, Beatleness, Candy Leonard, she talked about how Rubber Soul, which came out December of '65, was a major turning point as well for fans when they realized that the Beatles were really changing, and it left a lot of fans disappointed and in a little bit of shock, because sometimes boy band members can be viewed as so in time that when they change and evolve and become more adult in their content or just more mature and deep about their lyrics and just don't have those light and fun tunes you remember, it can be viewed as such a personal loss, like where is the person I used to know, where are the Beatles that I fell in love with? And so that was kind of how fans were feeling at the time, which led to a chorus of press releases and newspapers talking about how Beatlemania was on the downswing. But soon after, then the Beatlemania is Back headline was spread all over the place, and that happened a couple of times, as tends to be the media trend that people jump on and jump off very quickly. So Eventually, the Beatles themselves seemed to like the idea of Beatlemania retiring. Paul McCartney even said in some interviews that they were kind of half hoping for the downfall of Beatlemania at times. Ringo Starr said, quote, 4 years of Beatlemania was enough for anyone. And that may seem like that was it for the Beatles. And of course, they're still talked about now, but really their peak did end after just a few short years. But the term Beatlemania really did set a precedent. The term mania is used all the time now when referring to fans. Again, like I said before, with Bieber Fever, One Direction Infection, that terminology that views females as in hysterics over these people continues today. There were also, right afterwards, the term mania was coined a lot. For example, this team called the Bay City Rollers, people who were fans of them in Britain were called, it was called a roller mania movement right away, and so that was just one of many examples of that. So naturally, you could hear all of those examples of injuries and in police standoffs and other intense situations as being just exactly proving the fact that these female fans were hysterical and out of control. And that may seem like the case, but those are the incidents that were the most reported on, not the most common. And so that's what this is all about, and that's where the divide comes between how people view pop culture fans and sports fans, because it's about the coverage they get. The screaming fans are not really a key part of the story when recapping a football game. But the screaming fans at a concert do become suddenly a key part of the story about how the show was received, and that is not how the audience is described, if they're described at all, when talking about how the sporting event went. And so the spectatorship has just been characterized so differently, and so these events are viewed as common as opposed to being the exceptions to the norm. So again, the media can make it look like an event is super huge and constant when it's not. And that was the case with Beatlemania at times, where these crowds were insane, but insane in certain ways in terms of what they did that I don't think they should have done, of course, that were too intense. But there were so many that were more respectful than that, and so but that stuff doesn't make the news. The stuff that makes the news are the ones who are all out and what some people would call insane. If it leads, it bleeds is the phrase about the news media. And so if something is high stakes and high tension, and if there are feuds, there's violence, that stuff really, they're going to project on TV, of course, because it's great for viewership. Does it unfortunately get as much press attention and interest when it's just a good, wholesome story about fans coming together for an event? But that probably happened a lot like it continues today. Now, this was also the case with hooliganism, which has a very interesting backstory. So, hooliganism is essentially defined as conduct that is, I guess, disorderly at best and violent at worst, primarily characterized as being a UK phenomenon, but then spread over time, especially thanks to the internet. And hooliganism is essentially when football fans, soccer fans, if I accidentally say soccer, just know I'm talking about football. Anyway, so the soccer fans, they would get into feuds with fans of the rival team at events. They went from being in stadium events to spilling out onto the streets over time and leaving entire communities kind of wrecked or just in general disorderly. And they really did the opposite of keeping the peace when these teams got together. Their actions really became more and more coordinated over time, whereas hooliganism acts used to be so spontaneous. They turned into rival gang standoffs of sorts where people would link up basically and get their team ready and galvanize a group and post about it online. And thanks to the ease of travel over time too, with cars and everything, they were able to do that easier. It was also easier to engage in hooliganism knowing that you wouldn't get in trouble because, for example, if you lived in town A and were going to town B for a fight, you could cause havoc and destroy property in town B and then go home to town A and hope that the rule didn't apply to you or that they'd never catch you. And so it let that feeling anonymous and acting with impunity, as did getting to work anonymously coordinating these events online. So that's essentially what happened, and hooliganism has been studied by sociologists over time, and the takeaways I got from that research there are three main ones. One is that these hooligans, as they're called, viewed their feuds with rival sports team fans as needing to be as authentic as possible, so no weapons were recommended. It's actually better for your status in these groups if you just fight with your bare hands. Second of all, fan status for these outliers that are calling themselves hooligans here had nothing to do with how much they went to events or how much sports trivia they knew. Your status as a true fan for these groups was just about the amount of fights you were in and things like that. Third thing is that they had this mantra, kind of a pick on someone your own size, where it wasn't viewed as a good win worth celebrating if you won a fight against someone who was never going to win against you anyway. It had to be viewed as a fair fight and a real challenge. And so those were kind of the unwritten codes for these teams that would meet up and get really in each other's faces. So let's go through the timeline of how this unfolded, these subsets of sports fandoms. The original hooliganism is thought to have started in 1349, when actually they used a pig's bladder instead of a soccer ball. That is a fun/not fun at all fact. And the main objective of those games was kicking the ball into the rival team's church. So the king eventually banned the game because King Edward III banned it because it was causing so much social disruption to the peace, but it was originally considered an act of hooliganism. But the modern definition of hooliganism was viewed as being on display starting in the 1880s in Europe. It was primarily, again, started in the UK, really. 1885, Preston beat Aston Villa 5-0 in a football game, and the losers ended up throwing stones and beating up the winning team. One person was knocked unconscious during the scuffle, and there was considered a lack of justice after the fact because no security guards or guidelines were really in place. There wasn't a punishable law to work with because this was unprecedented. And over time, legislation did address this, which we will get back to in a second. The first reported incidents in police records are from London in 1898, showing violent street gang activity. That's how it was cited. But there were also some other events over time before and after that are worth noting. 1909 was when Glasgow versus the Celtics, both Scottish teams, competed, and fans on both sides were really upset because the referee did not allow overtime play, so the fans rioted. There were thousands of people there that caused injuries to security guards. They also caused property damage both in the stadium and outside of it into the streets nearby. And really, that really didn't lead to a lot of change, but suddenly it seemed like a much bigger issue in the 1960s. That is a time when actually moral panic started to be a thing in other realms as well, not just the sports world, but comic books and violence in movies and shows and things like that. All of that, suddenly moral panic started forming in the later half of the 1900s. It became a prominent issue for people to address these hooligans who attended football games. A main event that really emphasized this worry was the Heysel disaster of 1985. At that event, the Liverpool fans charged at their opponents, and it caused a wall to collapse and killing 39 people. So 1986, the following year, is when the Public Order Act went into effect, which allowed the courts to ban certain people from going to the stadiums. There was another act in 1989 called the Football Spectators Act that allowed courts to ban certain people from attending international football matches in any capacity. And then in the 90s, violence continued to spill out more onto the streets, and that led to the Football Offenses Act, which made it a criminal offense to throw missiles, engage in indecency, or in general, quote, go onto the pitch without lawful authority. So a lot more offenses were suddenly not legal. This was in part triggered by a Democratic Republic of Congo game in 1988 when the feuds got so intense that police opened fire on the crowd and actually ended up just injuring people, and they ended up making the situation and tensions worse. In April of 2000, 2 Leeds United fans got stabbed to death, and that was not just random or spontaneous violence, it was a coordinated attack by Turkish fans of the opposing team. Just a few quick other incidents. 2001 is when a match in Ghana resulted in some deaths, cops firing tear gas, fans fled the grounds, and people died not from anything previously, but just from actually trying to flee the scene that had gotten so tense. And so, due to a stampede, over 100 people were killed. In 2002, rival teams played in Brazil, and fans pushed so hard against the railing that it collapsed and fell, injuring 30. 2004 is when a match between rival Syrian soccer teams it resulted in a riot that caused 25 deaths. 2007, there was a temporary suspension of all soccer matches in Italy because there was this hooliganism incident that led to a cop's death. Then, after all of this, Scotland issued in 2012 this Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Act, which is a very long name for a law that basically just set up two new offense categories. One criminal offense category established was related to football, bigotry and hatred expressed in actions or words on the field or off but towards the rival team. The second broad law was about threatening communications, which is the term they used to describe more overt threats and more serious incitements of violence or threats of violence. So a lot of legislation was passed and issued over the years to address this incredible violence that formed between rival teams, but that didn't stop all of it from happening. It just caused them to be more covert in their forms. For example, rival teams would start wearing regular clothes. They used to proudly show off their team spirit, but then they decided to hide that attire so that security guards couldn't automatically know that they were a member of a certain hardcore set of fans and to know which side they were on, for lack of a better term. They also developed this habit called taking of the ends, when fans of one team would sit on one end of the field and the other team would sit on the opposite end, and then it was almost like an odd game of sorts where if you walked into the rival territory where the other team was sitting, it would lead to, basically they were inciting the violence themselves and triggering fights and stirring up hard feelings by walking on the other side's territory. It was quite a symbolic game that could lead to actual tension. So the changes in response to this habit was there was a seating option and new seating layouts were made that spread out people a little more. There was also an increased police presence at these sporting events and increased fines and other penalties. However, the events continued. They really just changed forms yet again. So today, hooliganism continues to be a thing. It can actually be less spontaneous again because it can be more coordinated thanks to the internet and its anonymity that gives more people the sense of freedom to engage in this activity. So it's still not infrequent, but actually the past decade, hooliganism has consistently been on a declining trend, as well as the number of arrests and reported incidents of it. The number of fatalities and severe injuries from these instances has also been on the decline globally for quite a while now. And so when they do get into fights now, it's not only less common, but it's cited as being less lethal. And another study revealed that was reported on by the BBC showed that 92% of the time, banning people works. They're very scared of losing their access to watch the shows and participate in helpful ways, or at least not harmful ones. So banning individuals from the stadiums temporarily works, and then after they come back, they don't engage in that behavior again. So that seemed to be the most appropriate course of action they should take going forward, is emphasize not police presence, which seems to escalate these issues. Ironically, the media publications all about fandoms that were taking things too far, that talked about Beatlemania and things like that, and referred to them as, stampedes and ambushes, mania, hysterics, all of those terms that were applied, were the same publications that were talking about these football fans at first as letting off steam, getting maybe a tad too heated, and talking about them just having fun, boys are being boys, goofing off, getting aggressive and rugged, and all of those terms applied to athletes and male fans of them. So that double standard was very constant. To be fair, though, it did change in the 70s to be more, after the 70s. So in the 80s, it really turned into more condemnation and direct, overt disapproval of the hooliganism. But the damage had been done in some ways, and that image still sticks in people's minds. And that's important to keep in mind, is how the media continues to use certain terms when referring to sporting events versus pop culture events still. So there is this characterization of these sporting events as being all as normalizing this ruggedness of it and these events. And so, for example, if I was writing a story about a football match that ended in teams, or not even ending in a hooliganism act, but just a football match and how it went, I might say one team got pummeled by the other, one team really won their battle or went to battle. There was, a war against this or that. The players, there was a clash. There was tensions were high. I don't know, but like terms like that kind of are associated with combat or just other terminology that refers to a pummeling and aggressive actions happening. But if I use those same terms in a pop culture context, like at the concert, fans created a stampede, that's a little less normalized. That's suddenly concerning to people. And so that contributed over time to the sense that it was just totally normal to have violence at these sporting events, at least a lot more often than it was. The level of violence that they could get away with at sporting events was a lot higher because it was viewed as normal to get into some rough and tumble activities versus pop culture viewing events, which were viewed as you have to be a little more respectful. And so that is a lot of stereotypical thinking at work. It also contributed over time to females in the media described as this collective monolith, as just a bunch of fangirls, whereas sports fans, they have been reported on constantly as individuals acting out. And so these events might be like this specific rival group it was more clear in coverage, like this subset of fans fought against this subset of fans, whereas the female fandoms, it was just all the girls were screaming, as opposed to a few girls here and a few girls there were fighting, when that might have actually been what happened. So over time, the constant reporting on male sports attendance and everything led to some groupthink and lack of context in describing why these guys were fighting, whereas for the girls it was viewed as there was no subset, no deeper context for any quote-unquote obsessive activity. It was all just emotions running high. It's just a lot of double standards that were at work here. Something worth keeping in mind also that shows that these events did not necessarily go away thanks to legislation, actually. One is that a lot of studies about hooliganism over time showed that alcohol was not really a key factor that provoked these incidents. So these incidents were entirely people of sound mind who knew what they were doing and intentionally liked to get into conflict. So dismissing boys will be boys behavior based on drinking at these sporting events does not have merit. Another thing to keep in mind is the fact that it was really a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. So these scholars who have studied hooliganism talk about the fact that during both World War I and World War II, coverage of these incidents of hooliganisms dropped significantly. But the incidents didn't necessarily. It's just that the media found better things to cover, more important things to cover because of the world wars going on. And so during those years, the reporting dropped. And then post-World War II, there was quite an uptick in stories about hooliganism incidents. So that just goes to show you that part of this is not what's really happening. It's how much time the media is willing to cover it based on how much they view it as worth covering. So these events may not be covered as much in certain times because the news is just ebbing and flowing and there are other things going on. So that doesn't mean that the amount of incidents has declined. That just means that it's being discussed in the public less. And another thing to keep in mind is that moral panics induced by the media don't actually work. All of the research shows that the public moral panics that are promoted by the media is with comic books too, but also in this context with sports and with mania of pop culture fangirls as they're described. That really is, the moral panics don't work. They don't stop people from acting like that. They just contribute to this belittling and stigmatization of these fans. And so it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, because what would happen with these hooliganism cases, that some people who wouldn't normally otherwise have been exposed to hooliganism culture were exposed to it thanks to the media talking about it in this moral panic sense, which actually made some rebellious young people more desiring to join. So, for example, if feeling very down on my luck, I was feeling misunderstood, I just wasn't finding a place where I belonged, and I turn on the TV and I see this cool exclusive club where I get to act all tough and reaffirm masculinity and feel feel strong, not weak, and feel a part of a group. And the media's talking about them as condemning them, but that makes me feel like I want to join them more. I'm going to be rebellious and probably go out and find a way to join them. And so it was a self-fulfilling prophecy where the media kept spreading the word about these groups, and then more people joined them, and more chaos happened, and then the media then reported on that chaos again, and it was a constant loop. And so that cycle is also part of the reason why these stereotypes of fangirls persist, because it would constantly be this belittling of these teenage fans, but that just left them feeling defensive of their interest. And then that defensiveness would lead to more passionate reactions when they saw them. All of that emotional buildup of feeling like they had to conceal their love for a band. So then when you did see them, you finally got to let out your love for them, really. So, for example, if I was part of the Beatlemania fandom, and I was constantly told in my life that it was silly, or I was way too obsessed with them, or it was just not an interest worth having, or I was made fun of for liking them. And then over time I probably would hide my love for them and kind of bury it, but it would build up inside me. And then when I could finally let it all out, it would be extra loud, it would be extra next level when I got to the airport or wherever to see a glimpse of them, because they were viewed as this taboo love. And the media would report that I had, gone berserk or whatever when I saw them at the airport, and then that would contribute further to the stigmatization fans were seeing of this group on TV and whatnot, and that led them to think it was wrong to like them, but they still did. It didn't stop them from liking them, and it just kept the cycle going. And so that's the same here. So Beatlemania, hooliganism, these incidents of fans being rabid, I guess you could say, all go back to arguments that counteract the assumptions that were made by people like Camille Bacon Smith, dismissing fans as just neurotic. They really tap into the sense that Sandvoss was talking about, where all of these fandoms, no matter what they love, it is a way that they can find a way to be in a community of like-minded people, to feel unjudged, to feel like they get to express their passion for a person or an event, to feel emotionally invested in something among people who are also emotionally invested in it. And so really it just has a lot of psychological benefits to be in a fandom. Both of these fandom extremes show, and those timelines of fandom extremes in some senses, are two main things. One is that those are subsets, and they are viewed as that's how fans are when that becomes the media story, when that's not the case. It's important to remember that there's so much variety within fandoms in their behaviors, in their beliefs, in what they say and do. Second thing is that this goes to show future studies and observations in general that anyone has about fandoms need to be less about wondering what it is that they love about what they love, but why they love it. So less about the perceived crushes they might have, or the perceived betrayal they feel when their team doesn't win the sporting event, but more about just internally, what are they getting out of being a part of that group? And shaming them doesn't really do anything. It doesn't, if anything, it makes them dig in their heels and want to show their support in even more intense ways for whatever they like. And so it's really important to just look at fans as individuals and not monoliths, and view them as using fandoms as a way to show who they really are and what they're into, and think about what these events symbolize for them, what seeing their idol symbolizes, what the football symbolizes, what the jersey and other sports gear symbolizes to them, and it's a big part of their identity. And so validating that can really keep the calm and boost their self-esteem, and is just so important. So all of this is really to show that no matter what you're a fan of, really, pop culture studies and fandoms, sports fandom studies, really never needed to be so different. And those characterizations of those groups of fans didn't need to be focused on to different extremes and legitimize different levels of behavior. The standards could have always been equal, but weren't. But there's still the opportunity to get out of those trains of thought of belittling certain fandoms when you don't call out the others in the same way. The standards can be leveled here, as if we keep in mind that every fandom has people who go to the extremes and every fandom has people who don't. What I'm trying to say here really is that both sports fans and pop culture fans they like what they like for the same root psychological reasons, and they fulfill similar social and emotional needs to be in these fandoms. And so any view of one of them as being more intense or obsessed as the other is really a product of the media and public perceptions and the feedback loop between the media and the public. And so any real difference is just not substantiated by any of the research in terms of just pathology, in terms of just social views, just like any real difference is not there between sports fans and pop culture fans and why they are parts of fandoms. We all are a fan of something, and they are just proof of that. I hope this was interesting and helped bring home a message about all fandoms and the internalized assumptions we have about who belongs in a fandom, and we will address this in more detail in different ways in coming episodes. So stick around for more of that coverage. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode of How to Stand, and I will see you all next week. Thank you for listening.